Welcome to UC3P, the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. My name is Caroline Kobzanski. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Robert Vargas, the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Sociology. He's also the founding director of the Violence, Law, and Politics Lab. He's a Chicago native and received his PhD from Northwestern University in 2012. Before coming to UChicago, he held posts at Harvard, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Notre Dame University. Dr. Vargas, welcome to UC3P.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Let's begin closest to home. What changes have you observed in the conversation about overhauling law enforcement this summer? What do you think brought those changes about?
I think the biggest change is the extent to which abolition and defunding the police has become part of the narrative around police reform and policing research. I would point to the killing of George Floyd, the massive economic suffering as a result of COVID-19, on top of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on people of color, particularly Black communities, I think created the perfect conditions for a massive uprising and massive social movements, to the point where the language of abolition or the arguments around abolition just can't be ignored.
Can you define for our listeners briefly what you mean when you say abolition? There are a lot of different definitions circulating.
I think that it's important to acknowledge that there are lots of different definitions. The way that I think about this particularly, I think of it analogous to the abolition of slavery. We're talking about getting rid of an institution in order to transform society. I think it's important to remember, like with slavery, the movement wasn't to abolish labor. Right. It was to abolish a particular form of labor. And the way I see the police abolition movement is something similar. I think people are advocating for an alternative institutional arrangement for providing safety in communities. And I think part of the reasons why it's gotten to this point is because the current institution of policing has become so insulated and so resistant to change that it's become this entity that folks are calling for dismantling.
Are you able to give me some background on how Chicago specifically came to have the CPD, the police force that we know today and that we experience when we're out walking in the city?
Really, the Chicago Police Department was one of the most corrupt in the country for the greater part of the early 20th century. And it wasn't until a guy by the name of O.W. Wilson, a Berkeley-trained criminologist who actually was the dean of the School of Criminology at Berkeley, who was hired to become the chief of police for the city of Chicago by Mayor Daley in the 1950s, precisely to clean up and professionalize the police department. That's when you begin to see the beginning of what would ultimately become the professionalized, unionized police that we see today. Wilson helped to standardize policies and procedures in the department, helped to improve training, helped to build the foundations of the police department. And so after he retired, beginning in the 1960s and then exploding in the 1970s under President Nixon, is when you begin to see all of this federal funding and support for local police departments to grow. And Daley, along with Chicago police chiefs, took up this opportunity to expand their police force with funding largely from the federal government, because cities have almost always been strapped for cash. Ever since then, it's been a similar pattern of growth through federal support. The 1994 crime bill was kind of kicking the can even further down that route. After 9/11, all of the expansion of the Department of Homeland Security kind of kicked the can of growth even further. The one thing that's slightly different now, I think over the last couple of years, especially in Chicago, is the role of private philanthropy in funding Chicago police. So, for example, Kenneth Griffin has donated millions of dollars to the city to help the police department develop its surveillance technologies. And so the form of support has almost always come from outside of the city. It's just been different actors and different arrangements.
Thank you very much. Previous attempts to reform police have included bias training or attempts to diversify police forces. Why do you think the calls have shifted now to abolition as opposed to these more inside the police force reforms?
I think because Chicagoans have a sharp memory. There have been so many, in the 1950s, when O.W. Wilson was brought to Chicago, he was brought in to reform the police department. In the 1990s, when the city adopted its community policing initiative, it was in part to reform the police department. The narrative around reform, around training, around all of these same terms has been repeated over and over and over again across multiple administrations. And while I think part of it is able to survive because you have so many new people moving into the city, but if you look at the group of folks who have been around the longest and have a sharp enough memory, they just know that these reforms don't deliver on their intended outcomes. People are fed up, and I think that the size and scale of the demonstrations we've been seeing are a testimony to the extent to which people have just lost faith in these institutions to reform themselves, which is why the call for abolition. I myself was never really a proponent of abolition until relatively recently, by virtue of getting up to speed on this history and these arguments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You referred to people coming in and out of cities in your previous answer. Can you tell me a little bit about how demographic change informs law enforcement or how it informs law enforcement policy?
I don't really think of it as demographic change. I think institutional change, more than anything, informs police department policy. The police have a constituency, and it also is trying to implement reforms, technologies, interventions that will satisfy this constituency. And it's a very particular constituency. I would describe it as business owners, business interests, people, real estate interests, folks who think that the police's primary goal should be to protect property. And so, depending on the state of the city's political economy, I think police departments respond to the conditions of the city's political economy. So some specific concrete examples of this are that in the 1990s, when the city was experiencing financial duress, it looked to the Clinton administration and the grants coming through for policing to implement new initiatives. Just like now, it's increasingly turning to private business and financial firms and foundations to kind of do the same thing, to develop new technologies that are aimed at just preserving the city's political economic structure. Because while the abolition movement, as if we want to call it that, talks about what policing is doing to communities, the other side of this argument, I don't know what you want to call it, the pro-policing movement, or however you want to call it, the folks who are in favor of reform, we have to remember that at the end of the day, the police department are an organization. And one of the classic ideas of organizational sociology are that organization's first priority is self-preservation, right? So in the 90s, they did that by turning to the federal government. And today, because the federal government is not as supportive, they're turning to private business and to philanthropy. And that's where we're seeing the same rhetoric around reform, but it's new technologies, right? It's an early alert system for detecting police misconduct. It's what the police chief called community policing on steroids. It's just kind of more of the same, but packaged in a different way, but serving a different set of constituents and a different set of funders.
Could I just ask you to clarify what parts of the federal government you see as being less amenable to assisting law enforcement?
I would say anything that's not the Department of Homeland Security. Our police chief has said countless times that police are asked to do too much, right? And I think that's a statement that many people agree with. I think it's a logical position. The federal government, though, will only give money to cities if it's for policing, if it's for like violent surveillance or the kind of police work that I think many will acknowledge already exists, that there's already too much of. So that's what I mean by the lack of federal government support, because like I think many can accept the idea that, oh, well, we need more mental health services, we need more social services. Well, the federal government isn't delivering on that. The federal government, we have to remember, isn't one distinct entity. It's made up of a lot of different offices. And if the federal government is only interested in providing one form of medicine and lots of that same medicine, that's a problem for the patient, right? In this case, the problem is the police who actually want help so that they're not doing everything that a good social safety net should be doing.
As some politicians begin to distance themselves from tough on crime legislation, while others double down on law and order pitches, what kinds of changes do you think we can expect to see in the way police operate, if you think we can expect any at all?
Honestly, what comes to mind, I feel like, they're more aesthetic changes than substantive changes. So, for example, we've gone from community policing to community policing on steroids. I mean, they're not even trying to like really invent new language to describe the same kind of technologies and interventions that they're using. The folks at the Harris School have been put in charge of creating a new early intervention system for police officers to try and identify officers who are most likely to engage in misconduct. A previous effort was made to do this in the 90s that failed. That's what I mean by the change is probably going to be mostly aesthetic and superficial than actually substantive. I think what's most likely to come are like really creative media outreach efforts. I think that the difference is that I think that the police department is relying more than ever on scientists to legitimize their technologies and the effectiveness of their interventions. That's, I think, one major change. And so it's in some ways, it's kind of like couching what has been done before, but under a new narrative around science, objectivity, and effectiveness and policy.
This conversation shows no sign of receding anytime soon. What knowledge do you want to make sure our listeners have about policing in Chicago in the long term?
There's so many. I don't know where to begin. I guess I would encourage listeners to apply the deep kind of critical analysis that you get from a place like the University of Chicago towards discussions about the effectiveness of policing interventions, to like question rigorously the science coming out of police interventions in Chicago, because when you look and inspect it very closely, these efforts violate some of the core principles of science, data transparency, replication, pursuing outside of the box, radical new ideas for solving a problem. To me, it's fascinating, but also kind of infuriating that the language of science is being co-opted to legitimize what is an inherently undemocratic and anti-scientific way of doing policy.
And that's a wrap on another episode of UC3P. Thank you again to Professor Robert Vargas. Credits go to Caroline Kobzanski for interviewing, producing, engineering, and editing. Our assistant production managers are Jack Emery and Ioana Lapuri. Our finance director is Aishwarya Kumar. Our communications director is Olu Ogidan, and our publisher is Yining Wang. Our intro music is Knockout 2 by Dutubi, and our outro music is Yes Yes Y'all by Matt Large. Our cover art was designed by Shirin Raban. Please visit us on our website, uc3p.org. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. My name is Siddhant Wadera, and the main page will be back next week with an episode exploring polling in